All right, we're going to be back into the book of Esther, but I want to kind of share one of my my hardwirings that causes me trouble sometimes. Yesterday we were on our way to a district picnic, and there was something that was driving me nuts. You know, when I'm using GPS, on my phone, I am the guy that when I see an estimated time, that's a challenge. I can beat that. And so yesterday, my wife and I and our kids and Sarah were headed over we had a district picnic for all the official workers and their families in our district. We did some short business, and they just had some fun time just visiting with other pastors and their families in the district. But on the way there, after we picked up Sarah, it was driving me crazy because I love to be on time. And when we pulled out of Sarah's driveway, we were going to be on time. And although I was doing every bit of the speed limits, it kept adding minutes. It added 13 minutes by the time we got there. And it actually ended up being a bottleneck. The park we were in, there was this one-lane bridge, and I think it was accounting for that because it was pretty accurate on our arrival. But it was driving me crazy because I'm like, man, this is a challenge. When we go on road trips, I love to just get there. If you know, when we used to visit Wendy's sister in Texas and New Mexico, I've been known to drive straight there and straight back, like 1,600 miles. Drive through the night. The last time that didn't work out so swell for us because at like 4 a.m. in the middle of Illinois or Indiana, the middle of one of those states, it was Illinois. Jacob was puking in the middle of the night, car sickness and stuff, and so that was the last time we did it. My wife said we won't do that again, and I said yes, dear. But I love to get there and be there. Now I'm curious. I know some people don't like to show hands. How many of you are like me? Like, that's a challenge. Let's be honest. All right. Richard, yeah. I'm with you, brother. How many of you are like the people that you're like, man, it's about the drive and the journey and kind of, look at around. How many of you would be that? Okay. Now, what is funny is when you saw one of the couples, of a couple raise their hand on one and the other raise, that causes conflict, doesn't it not? I'm fortunate that my wife is usually pretty gracious towards it. But the reality is there's kind of two ways of looking at a journey, especially when you talk about vacation or traveling any sort of distance. Probably most of us, if it's commute to work or whatever, you're just like, I'd rather just get there, especially in the traffic that's around here. But, my problem in my hardwiring is I can easily miss what's along the way. I can just be so intent on getting there that we don't necessarily enjoy the sights and things to see. First time we went to Texas, it was 2 a.m. when we were crossing the Mississippi in St. Louis. I saw the arch. It's really pretty at night. And I'm like nudging Wendy, like, hey, look. And she's waking up. Okay, and she went back to sleep. My kids didn't even see the arch, right? We missed it because I was so intent on getting there as fast as possible. Life in the same way, I think, is like that. So often, some of us at least, we can have this destination, this place we're headed to in this season, this status or this kind of comfort that we're headed to, that we're wanting to get to, and we can miss some of the stuff that's along the way. We can miss some of the purpose of the journey that God has for us. And so as we jump into the book of Esther, I think we're kind of at one of those pivotal times in Esther's life where she needs to stop and recognize the significance of the moment and not be so worried about just getting further down the road. And so if you'll turn with me, we'll be in the end of Esther chapter 4. Starting in verse 9, working through the end and working into the first bit of 5. We're going to start moving quickly through Esther. We will conclude this study before I leave on my sabbatical. And so the elders will be preaching something else. In Esther 4, starting in verse 9, it tells us this. It says that Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. And remember, he said, you need to go plead for us with the king. The Jews are going to be eradicated. This is what's happened just before this. There's this big plot. There's this day scheduled where people are going to be allowed to go murder anyone if they're a Jew. And so Mordecai tells Esther, the queen now, who he'd raised, he said, listen, you need to go and plead with the king. And she says this. She said, when she instructed him to say to Mordecai, this is what she says, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So there was this law on the Persian books that said if you were not summoned by the king, you did not approach him. Now, we kind of have a concept of this. How many of you have told your kids, don't talk unless you're being spoken to, right? Especially when they're just carrying on about something ridiculous and you need them to just be quiet for a little bit. We've had that. And so in the Persian court, there was this idea that if you were not there was 7 friends of the king was what they were called, and several historians have recorded this, that there were 7 men who were called friends of the king. They could come unannounced. Haman was one of them. Anyone else, though, he would have to extend the golden scepter. And we actually have in some pictures, some things from this time period, from the Persian court. There's a picture that has been found of actually King Darius, before King Xerxes here, who has the golden scepter in his hand, and behind his throne is an executioner. And it illustrated the idea that if you came in, it wasn't like you're sent off and you're going to die someday in the future. If you came in and he did not extend the golden scepter, they're going to take your head off right now. Now, I want you to think about this. So we know that Esther is about 5 years into her marriage. Now, a lot of people know, and maybe, hopefully this hasn't been the case for you, but a lot of marriages, 5 years in, the coals have died down a little bit. Let's be honest, right? Things are not nearly as hot and heated and just, passionate. And so it appears that the king's love and his adoration for Esther has died because he hasn't even called for her in a month. He had to have her when they went through the process, but now he's like, yeah, I'm okay, I'm good. I don't know if he's spending time with any of his concubines or what, but he hasn't called for her. And we know that if Esther approaches, there is this question. You remember when Vashti, Queen Vashti, at the beginning of this book, did not listen to the king's order, he got rid of her. And they said they needed to make an example of her. And so in Esther's mind, there has to be this thought that if I go before the king, are the king's advisors going to say, see, we got to keep these women, remember that was the order. They were all worried about keeping the women under control. We need to make an example out of you, the queen. Would they advise him to do that again? She recognizes there's a very real likelihood that as she approaches the king, she will be killed. Made an example of. Now, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, she sent back this answer. He sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Now, he gives back this challenge. Now, it's interesting. There are some commentators actually think that this is like a veiled threat, like Mordecai's threatening to oust her, tell the officials that she's a Jew too. I don't think that would be the case. I mean, that seems pretty harsh, doesn't it? Like he would, purposely try to kill his niece. But I think what Mordecai is getting at is a couple key things here. He says, first of all, he says, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. I think Mordecai recognizes, first and foremost, that God in his sovereignty, if he has deemed something to happen, if he says this will come true, if he has made a promise about it, there is nothing that exists in heaven or earth that can stop it. And so he is saying, listen, if you don't step up, God will raise up someone else. But there's a bit of a warning here. that if you are not obedient to what God has called you to, there is a very real danger in that. Friends, sometimes we think about being in the center of God's will and following Him as this kind of mushy, just feel-good journey. But the reality is that our God is a holy God, and if you are not in the center of His will, you are in a dangerous place. Because He will accomplish His purposes. He will move His agenda forward. And if you are not willing to be a part of that which He has deemed will happen, you stand in some serious danger. And so that's what he says. And I think, as he's talking about this, Isaiah speaks to this as well in chapter 46. Isaiah says this, "Remember this, keep it in mind, take it to heart, you rebels." Now, lest you think yourself more holy than you ought, the Bible says we're all rebels, so get used to it. "Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God and there is no other. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. I say my purpose will stand and I will do all that I please. From the east I summon a bird of prey, from a far off land a man to fulfill my purpose. What I have said that I will bring about, what I have planned that I will do." And so what we see here is Mordecai is reminding Esther, listen, God will accomplish His will. And now I've talked about in the past that kind of the theology I've drawn out of Scripture, there seems to be like an ultimate will of God. Like there's things that He has said will come to true and there's nothing that can shake them. There seems to be some provisional will things that like His intent is to use this person to move this forward, and that can be derailed by our will, but His ultimate purpose never changes. And I think that's even in the Lord's Prayer we saw that and we talked about that. There seems to be kind of a juxtaposition of both, where God is completely sovereign and God has granted us free will. And so I think in this case it's that idea that, listen, God's ultimate purpose, He has promised to protect and save His people. That will happen. Mordecai's asking the question of her, what if you are His intended agent for that? And if you are not, He will raise up someone else. If you are not obedient, He will raise up someone else. And so he asked this question that I think we all need to ask of our lives. Wherever you're at right now, I don't know. I mean, maybe you're just cruising along and things are going really well. Maybe you're at some juncture where there's decisions to be made. Maybe you're wondering about how you're supposed to reach your neighbors or why God has placed you in this position here. Oftentimes we can so look at our lives and we begin to think about that end point, right? Well, I have to do this because of this. Many of you know I have a second job. I drive truck on my off day. I drive dump truck. And I could easily see that as like, man, I'm doing this because we need a little extra money. Okay, that's okay. Until Wendy starts working, that's a need. But the greater question is, why does God have me there? Does He have me there just for money? Because I would argue no. He could provide that in an instant. But what He does have is things like when I get to sit down and have lunch with a non-believer and talk about things of faith. And as a pastor, here's the thing. We often live in this little bubble. We're surrounded by all you nice Christian folk. And we don't necessarily always interact with non-believers. And so God has opened that door. And I think we have to ask ourselves the same question that we see Mordecai asking Esther. Who knows? What if you have come to this position in your life for such a time as this? Now we see that Esther is obedient. She begins to put some things in play. So Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Friends, I think we do it. Some of us do this sometimes, but it seems like we can hit like really crucial moments in our lives, and it's really easy to dismiss, be like, you know what, no one cares. No one really worries about this little thing in my life. And we kind of keep it to ourselves. Here we see Esther, I think, takes the scriptural approach. She's at a crucial juncture, and she's saying, listen, Those people of faith, would you pray with me? Asking people to pray through the journey with her. Whatever your journey you're in, whatever thing you're facing, it's okay to ask. Like, there's people in this room that love to pray for you. I love to pray for you. Let us know. I'm asking you, as I'm away for 4 weeks and seeking fresh vision for my life and for what God has for our church, I'm asking you, join me in prayer. And that's what we see Esther does. She calls for a fast. And if you remember from my sermon on fast, I believe this was a 3-day full-on fast. No food or water. She's asking them to get down and beg God for intervention. And she says, do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my attendants will fast with you. She even gets the people that are not necessarily part of the Jewish family of faith to join her in this. This is a great way to reach people. When you're struggling with something, getting them to join you in the process of seeking God. And she said, when this is done, I will go to the king, and even though it is against the law. And listen to her words. And if I perish, I perish. But we cannot take that any bit lightly. She understands her life is on the line, and she says, after seeking the Lord, if I perish, I perish. She understands that if it is God's intention that she die trying, she's okay with that. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. We see a little bit of a reversal here. Mordecai's been the one kind of leading Esther and coaxing her along. And here she steps up to the plate and takes the lead. Now, I think there was a kind of, in a sense at this point, this was a bit of an identity crisis for Esther as well. We know from earlier in the book, she had 2 names, right? Hadassah and Esther. Hadassah being her Jewish name, Esther being her Persian name. And I think in some ways this crucial point of turning was she had to decide whether she was Esther the Persian or Hadassah, the woman that belongs to the family of faith. And so often the things that come into our lives, if we really think about them, are kind of a choice between there. Are we going to side with the worldly thinking that leads us astray, or are we going to side with who we are in Christ? And often those will contradict. So on the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. So she goes in and approaches the king. Now, it seems to be that she kind of stood at a distance. She didn't just come running in. But one of the things that I really caught in this passage that I think is neat, she put on her royal robes. Esther was humble before God. She knew that, if the God decides that I should perish, then I'll perish. It's in his hands. But she is not shy. She is not meek about who she is. She understands God has made me queen of Persia, and so she puts on her royal robes, and she goes in there in the full authority of who God has placed her to be. When we go into situations where there might be tension or there's going to be maybe conflict, so often in our attempt to be humble, we can really kind of belittle ourselves and not walk in the authority. But friends, as sons and daughters of Jesus Christ, or of the Heavenly Father, as co-heirs with Christ, we have an authority. We can walk in confidence into these situations. And I think that's what she does. She puts on her royal robes, she goes in, but she does, acknowledge the authority of the king, and she seems to stand back. And it tells us the king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. When we walk in obedience to God's will, he will do incredible things. He will move mountains to accomplish that which he has for us. If there had been a moment of hesitation on the king's part, his advisors might have been right there telling him to off Esther. But God had already turned his heart. He was pleased with Esther, and he extends the scepter and spares her life. This was literally a pardon. And not only a pardon, look what he says. He said, then the king asked, What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you. Now, did he mean that literally? It was kind of a saying among kings, but basically saying, hey, whatever your request, within reason, let's have it. So not only did he spare her life, he's saying, listen, you know what? I love you. What do you want? Up to half the kingdom. And Esther's reply is interesting. I think she uses a little bit of tact. She's walking in authority, but she's also using some tact and knows that she can't just rush into things. And so she says, if it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. And the king says, we'll bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asked. Esther knew her husband, all right? I don't think there's anything wrong with utilizing what we know of a situation. Is it manipulative? I don't know. She knew her husband. And let's be honest, how many times have you heard the way to a man's heart is through his stomach? So she says, listen, hubby, I prepared a big banquet for you and your buddy Haman. Did you come on out? Of course he's going to say it. What guy is going to say no? Your wife comes to you and says, hey, dear, I made you a big T-bone steak and some taters and all the good fixins. What guy is going to be like, no, I'm not hungry? Let's be honest. Even if we aren't hungry, even if we've just snuck a snack that we weren't supposed to have, we're still going to be like, oh, yeah, bring on the steak. And that's how some of us get the figures we have. Praise Jesus for the truth. So she asked him to come to a banquet. She's using a little bit of tact. And so the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. Now, interesting thing, it says, as they were drinking wine, the king asked Esther. Now, I think Esther probably has a little bit, she knows her husband. Last time when there was an interaction between this dude and his wife that Scripture records that involved alcohol, it didn't turn out well for his wife. Remember, he was drunk when he banished Queen Vashti? And so I think there might be a little bit of wisdom in her to say, this is not the time to ask. When he's plastered, maybe I shouldn't throw something big on him. I don't know, maybe she should. But she doesn't. She uses some tact and she says, so he asked her, now what is your petition? He knows she didn't just come waltzing in and risk her life to fix him a steak. He knows something's up. Come on, we do this with our spouses, don't we? You butter them up a little bit before, like, oh, what do you really want? None of you do that? You are so much more holier than me. So people do this, right? She butters him up a little bit. He's not stupid. He's like, all right, what do you really want? What is your petition? It'll be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. So he makes an offer again. So he's obviously still feeling pretty benevolent towards his wife, and who wouldn't at this point? She just had a big meal for him. She appealed to his ego in making this special banquet. She appealed to his stomach. He's a happy guy. And Esther's reply is this, my petition and my request is this, if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request. Come on, now let's put it in American terms. If you love me, no one's ever said that to your wife, have you, or your husband? See, I see smiles, but no one admitting it. So she said, listen, if you like me, if I'm all that you say that I am to you, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to another banquet. What guy is going to say no to that? Hey, I just fixed you a T-bone steak. What do I want? Tomorrow, come again. Tomorrow's lobster. All right. If you don't like lobster, salmon. Oh, man. Good salmon. It's a spiritual experience for me if I have really good salmon. Just ask Justin. He took me to a seafood restaurant down in Orlando, and it was an experience. I think I looked zoned, and yeah, it was good. He asked me if Jesus was giving me a massage or something because I was so in the moment, so good. But this is what she does. She fixes him this wonderful banquet and says, listen, tomorrow, come back again. I'll fix your favorite dish. Let's do this again. And so this is what we have. And so she says this, and she says, then I will answer the king's question. So she's like, listen, hubby, you're on to me. You know what's going on, but let's do this again tomorrow, and then I'll tell you. Man, she is buttering him up. You know, I mean, she must think he's like a slice of toast that she's got to butter him up so much, but that's what it is. And so we see her beginning to work this process. Now, this is where we're going to stop. We're going to look at kind of the whole exchange, what happens next week. But we see Esther caught in a moment of crisis in her life and choosing to do the right thing. But she does it wisely. She does it with tact. And I think this is a good example when we talk about when Jesus said that we're to be as innocent as doves, but as shrewd as serpents, right? It's okay to use this thing between our ears. We can do that and still be innocent in following the Lord. And so she uses a little bit of tact. And so I want to end kind of the discussion on this. I think we need to ask ourselves, anytime I read these verses, I have to ask myself, why are you where you are in your life? What is God's purpose for where you are planted? If you haven't asked yourself this in the last month, I think you should. Because our lives are constantly changing. It's interesting. You know, the one thing that doesn't change is the fact that change occurs, right? No matter how much we don't like change and we don't like things to be different, our lives are constantly changing. We're all getting older. None of us are getting younger. And things, change in life as our kids grow up and, life circumstances change and as our bodies age and things that we used to be able to do now hurt a lot more when we do them. And we don't listen to our bodies that say, you shouldn't do that anymore. Things constantly change. And so we have to be asking the Lord, Lord, why this? Why now? Why here? Because if we're not asking Him, if we're worried about the next thing, maybe, what's the next big thing? What am I shooting for? Is it my vacation that's not like 2 months away? Is it this event at the church? Or is it, one of my kids are getting married, and so right now everything else is on hold until there. But God's will, I think, is so prevalent here that we need to ask ourselves, but what about now? Why am I right here in this moment? What is God asking me to be a part of? Maybe it's a crisis of identity. What crisis of identity is God calling you to right now where you need to decide which side you stand on? We have to ask ourselves these questions regularly because if we don't, friends, if we're just cruising along and all we're thinking about is like, well, it's the same day in and day out. I'm on autopilot and I'm someday arriving at the next big thing. Retirement or I don't know what it is for you, a better job or whatever. If we're on that autopilot, friend, I think we miss, just like I miss on the journey when I'm so bent on getting there and beating that GPS, we miss the things that God would have for us along the way. The times when He would invite us in and say, hey, I got this really cool thing I'm doing right here. I want you to be a part. And oftentimes, it's not the big situations like Esther has here. Oftentimes it's the little things. We're on our way to something big, but God invites us into something really neat along the way in the everyday and the mundane. I'm going to pray for us. I'm going to ask that you just be seeking God for that this coming week.